Until recently, we believed that the microbes that we find on a human skin, in their gut, in their mouth, were the result of exposure after birth, and that while the baby was in mom's uterus, that it was not exposed to microbes, that this was a completely sterile environment. We're finding bacteria in many places that we don't expect them to be now that we have very sensitive mechanisms by which we can look for DNA. And there's some evidence, this is from a paper in 2010, that the baby's intestines might actually be colonized even before birth, which is really incredible. But we still believe the main mechanisms are birth itself. And so when a baby is squeezed through the birth canal, all of the organisms in mom's vagina are basically spread over the baby as he or she is being squeezed out. So we actually know when we look at the composition of the vaginal microbiome that it changes before birth. So what you would find in a woman who's not pregnant versus someone who's about to give birth, there's actually different microbes there. It's like the mom's body cultivates microbes that are going to be essential for the baby. And in fact, we find organisms like lactobacillus that are important in helping babies digest milk that suddenly are in abundance in mom's vaginal tract before giving birth. So it's a pretty incredible finding. Human milk, we find 600 different species of bacteria. So that's clearly a source of the gut microbiome for babies. And we know that these microbes are not there for no reason. They actually help the baby digest some of the sugars that are in breast milk. And we know that some of the sugars that are in breast milk are there to cultivate healthy microbes that we want to have develop in the gut. So the milk itself is feeding the baby, but it's also feeding these beneficial microbes so that the baby's gut will be populated with them. So it's definitely a mutualistic relationship. One of the really interesting things that we're learning more and more about is how important microbes are for the development of a normal immune system. And I'm going to show you a little, in the next slide, a little bit more information. But people have been trying to understand for a long time why things have really shifted in terms of the human response to the microbes in our environment. Up until the 19th century, and when we had Lister and Pasteur and Semmelweis, there was very little hygiene. People didn't wash their hands. They tended to live in rural environments. And it turns out that they were exposed to a lot more microbes than we are today. And while, having worms can stunt your growth and do terrible things to your health, it seems that some exposure to even some of these nasty pathogens actually results in fewer allergies, which is amazing. So what changed in the 19th century? Well, the Industrial Revolution changed, our understanding of hygiene changed. People began to move away from farms. There was more access to clean food and water. Fewer people were suffering from parasites. When you take people out of a rural environment and put them in a city environment, people are going to have less exposure to dirt and livestock that contain parasites. And people began to get healthier. They experienced fewer infections with viruses, bacteria, worms, etc. And while all that is really good, again, being infected with worms can stunt your growth and do terrible things for you. One of the things that we began to notice was that people were also seeing an increase in things like allergies and autoimmunity. And the theory right now, and I've seen the ideas for how this work change over the years, is that what happens when you take a baby and you put it in a really safe, clean environment. Those moms, right, that carry the packs of hand sanitizers everywhere, and they're cleaning anything their baby touches. So you think that that's a really harmless, safe environment. What happens though is that it seems that those kids what we end up is an overproduction of some immune cells that produce cytokines, and they stimulate the immune system. It's almost like what happens is these things that shouldn't be causing an immune response do, and that results in allergies and autoimmunity. If you expose the babies to more diverse microbiomes, so compare a baby raised in the United States to someone raised on a farm in Africa somewhere, where there's less hygiene and of course way more infectious disease. So we're not saying right now that it's a perfect trade-off. What you do see though is you see a lot more of these regulatory T cells. We'll talk about these a little bit more when we talk about the immune system. And it seems that these play a really important role in telling these T helper cells when to be on alert and when to back off. And so this more diverse microbiome seems to play a really beneficial role in developing a normal immune system that doesn't overreact when exposed to things that are harmless, like peanuts and bee stings and things like that. So this has a name, this theory. It's called the hygiene hypothesis. And I'm going to show you this little video here. I'm going to do it in the lecture because it's not captioned, and that way I can caption it for you.
Antibacterial soap, hand sanitizer, disinfectant wipes, all part of a growing effort to sterilize our environment to avoid getting sick.
A, that's simply not possible, and B, it's probably not healthy.
You heard that right. Being overly clean may actually be bad for you.
There's a hypothesis, it's been called the hygiene hypothesis, that says kids raised on farms, for example, or in poorer socioeconomic settings end up with less allergies, for example, less autoimmune diseases, and appear to be healthier.
He says, sure, if you or someone you know is sick, use these products to try and stop the infection from spreading, but it's important not to go overboard.
You do need to be exposed to a certain amount of viruses and illnesses in order to have optimal immunity.
Dr. Poland says more research is needed to better understand hygiene hypothesis, but in the meantime, he says stop trying to sterilize and stick to just washing your hands. For the Mayo Clinic News Network, I'm Ian Roth.
It's interesting to watch that video in the context of coronavirus and our fear that, we need to wash our hands extensively, and people are using sanitary wipes to try to clean everything. And, these are extreme circumstances, but they're actually not a way to live long term. And this is one of the reasons why. There was a really interesting study. I don't know when the study came out exactly, but I know that it was reported in 2016. So it was very close to that time, where they actually took two groups of children. They looked at I hope I say this right, they looked at the Huttites and they looked at Amish children. Hutterites, I think is how you say it. So they looked at the Hutterite children and Amish children. So just as a background, about 10% of kids have asthma in the United States. And we're talking about this hygiene hypothesis and the idea that people are trying to understand why kids who seem to live in more rural settings and have more exposure to livestock and dirt, etc., they seem to have lower rates of asthma than other kids. So what they did was they took a group of the Hutterites and a group of Amish, and they both originate from, I think one's from Austria and the other is from Switzerland. And so they're very similar from a genetic point of view. You wouldn't expect there to be a big difference between these two groups. But they're both farmers, which is great too, because we want to have as few variables as possible in our study. But the Amish tend to operate small farms. The kids are exposed to lots of dust and animals. They live very closely with them. The Hutterites live in a different part of the country. They operate big farms. The kids almost never get into the farm itself. It's much cleaner, more sanitary. And they analyzed the dust from the Amish farms and the Hutterite farms, and they compared it, and they saw way more organisms that were actually in the in the Amish dust. So the Amish kids are the ones that have lower levels of asthma. The Hutterites have higher levels of asthma. And then they took blood from these kids and they compared the blood from the Hutterite kids to the Amish kids. And they found that in the Amish kids, they had far more neutrophils, which kind of showed that they were undergoing sort of low-level infections all the time, fighting off infections. In the Hutterite kids that have the higher levels of asthma, they found instead high levels of eosinophils, which we do associate with asthma and autoimmune types of diseases. And they decided that they would also take some of this dust, and they looked at mice, and they were able to reproduce this protection against asthma, autoimmune diseases by exposing the mice to this Amish dust. And so this is a really nice study that really supports this idea that it's actually exposure to microbes, lots of them, not necessarily dangerous ones, but ones that really get your immune system to recognize what's friend and what's foe, to develop these regulatory T cells that basically suppress immune responses that are not beneficial. And this was a really nice, very recent study that really supported this idea in the hygiene hypothesis. So are we telling you not to wash your hands? I feel like it's really important to say no. You should absolutely continue to wash your hands for 20 seconds. Do you need to sanitize everything with Lysol wipes? No, not after coronavirus is under control. And really it shouldn't be part of your day-to-day life. Even before this study came out, my kids were born in the mid-2000s. I would go out with other moms and they would all have their sanitary wipes and they'd be wiping things down, and my kids were eating dirt. And they would look at me and say, but you're a biologist, and why are you letting your kids get exposed to all these terrible things? And, you know, it was a lot easier to not have to clean everything. So that's certainly part of it. But I wasn't worried about it because I knew about the hygiene hypothesis, and I felt like they were better off not getting, or to get exposed to lots of different potential antigens and really hopefully train their immune system early on not to overreact. Let's say one more thing about microbiomes. There are familial similarities. It makes sense. If you live in the same house with another person, you will notice that over time, your microbiomes will be very similar. And this is because you're exposed to the same surfaces, the same foods, etc. And it makes sense that the same microbes would end up colonizing your body. We notice that the microbiome changes as you age. We can look at small children and then look at them at 1 year. I mean, there's a huge development of the gut microbiome over that year. The gut is radically different in a 1-year-old than a newborn. Microbiomes change with your health. So if you are in a nursing home and you're taking lots of antibiotics, for sure, that's going to affect your microbiome. You're going to be more vulnerable to these super infections. Your diet will affect your microbiome. Stress can affect your microbiome, where you live, your disease state, etc. And again, you know, we don't understand all of the different relationships. It's an area of really active research, but we're starting to believe that a person's health may depend at least somewhat on the composition of the microbiome. Remember, we were talking about genotype and phenotype? You know, if you take those Amish kids, they are exposed to different microbes in their environment. They have a different phenotype. They have a healthier, less asthmatic phenotype than the Hutterite kids. So we know that the environment plays a role in your health. And it looks like the microbiome that you end up developing as a child can have a really beneficial or a harmful effect on your disease phenotype as you get older in life. Our next set of lecture slides, we're going to talk about some nomenclature, understanding why do we name diseases the way they do. Not super exciting, but it's a good one for developing flashcards. So maybe be thinking about using a program like Kahoot or a program like Quizlet so that you get familiar with these terms.